Good to see you, Kari.
Good to see you.
Yeah, this is another coaching conversation, and we've chosen to evolve it from maybe a monologue in our past few sessions to more of a conversation. Before, we each came prepared with a topic of our own choosing, but that wasn't much of a conversation. At least I didn't feel that way. So today, I think we're going to discuss something that we both have listened to. It's a podcast by Mel Robbins. Does the podcast have a name? Is it the Mel Robbins podcast?
I think it's the Mel Robbins podcast.
Okay. And this is courtesy of Kari Watterson, because she shared this with our coaching group and thought it was a great interview with Steven Bartlett, who is a CEO in Europe and is the youngest, I believe, who is on the English version of Shark Tank and is a serial entrepreneur and the number one business podcast in Europe, Diary of a CEO. And you have something to say?
Yeah, you know what, Ken? Actually, so he is I suppose he's the CEO of his own company now, but
Yeah.
he used to be the CEO of Social Chain. Long story short.
Social Chain. Thank you. Okay, I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah.
That's
Did
great.
you know about Social Chain?
No, I didn't know about Steven Bartlett. I heard of Mel Robbins. All this is very new to me, but Social Chain, and as a serial entrepreneur, he started many different companies. In fact, in high school, it sounded like it's when he started making it himself. So, they're going to talk about the art and science of decision making. That's the title of this particular podcast. And I think we are the sum of our decisions, is how Mel Robbins starts off this podcast. And I think that is a very profound point, that the importance of decision making underscores the importance of decisions. She says that we make 35,000 decisions a day. And so one of the most critical things we can do is wrap around our heads around making those decisions. And that's what she's going to interview Steven Bartlett on, because this is one of her heroes. She calls him like the number one person, like in a class by himself. That's how much she respects Steven Bartlett. And, I think the main message I'm going to put out here, I'm not going to save it for the end, is that what you want to do is align with your decisions so that you're more of who you are. And this is one of the first principles, or the main message that I got away from this podcast. I think there are several things I liked very much about what Steven Bartlett and Mel Robbins had to say. And what I want to do is see what your just overall impressions were. And if you want to start maybe with one of your key takeaways, we can take the conversation to that point.
Yeah. I've been listening to Mel Robbins, her podcast, and following her work and reading some of her books for years. And also, actually, a client of mine turned me on to Steven Bartlett's podcast. I didn't even know it existed, but I'm so grateful that she turned me on to it, because he and Mel have a host of really interesting guests that make me think a lot. And so recently Steven Bartlett had Mel Robbins on the podcast. Recently, I think within the last couple of years. And then of course, for her to have him on the podcast, it was just a really interesting exchange when one is the host, one is the one person, being the guest, and then switching it. But the main takeaway that I took, and probably I had a preconceived idea of how the conversation would go, just because I'm fans of both of their podcasts. But I know on Steven's website, the Diary of a CEO podcast website, is the quote, and I wrote it down because to me, it is the sum of what he stands for. Mm-hmm. And it's self-awareness, is realizing there's no opponent. You're fighting against yourself. And so in terms of the art and science of decision-making, that's the context.
I don't mean, I'm great at interrupting people. So I'm being self-aware. As I tell you, I'm interrupting you. Do you mind, for the audience and for myself, stating that quote one more time? Because I thought that was a really good quote.
Yeah. And again, this quote is on his website, the podcast website, Diary of a CEO. He's got multiple businesses, but it says self-awareness is realizing there's no opponent. You're fighting against yourself.
Okay. Yeah.
And the reason why I brought that up in the beginning is because I think that it does tie into maybe the title of the podcast. You and I were kind of talking about the title and how we wondered if it was actually the actual true substance that we got out of it. But if you really take that self-awareness is realizing there's no opponent, you're fighting against yourself, and you use that to inform your decision making, I think that's where, you know, how you start with the premise and it kind of, what you take in is filtered through a specific premise that you hold on to. I can see how the conversation plays out through that, where it's basically once you realize that you're the limitation in your own way, it helps you decide what decisions to make and how you're making them, what decisions you're not allowing yourself to make moving forward. And so obviously each one of us are going to come to listening to that podcast, maybe with a different premise. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I put that up there in the beginning, so that maybe somebody might be able to hear that and say, is that something that, you know, if I keep that in my awareness, you know, is that maybe how I might listen to it? And then just being interested in what follows after that.
Yeah, he talks about us, like if we were to take a list of our challenges in life, that most of the obstacles are self-imposed. How we describe in the podcast, which is exactly what he says on his website. He gives the example of was it an ant, and you draw a line around it.
Yes.
And then the ant cannot escape that circle because of his own self-limit, or her own, if it whatever the ant is,
Right.
self-limitations. I happen to be reading Adam Grant's Think Again at this, we talked about that in our last podcast or video, whatever we're calling these segments. And I've now read chapter 1, which is about intellectual humility. And it's the whole premise of the book about think again. And so I think that's another way to access what Steven Bartlett is saying, is that we have to be willing to question not only the world, which is Steven Bartlett's unique gift from a very early age.
Yeah.
It's defying status quo. Do grades matter? Well, I can make money without grades. So he got either dropped out or was kicked out of his school in England, and he didn't need grades. And in addition to defying convention, whatever is kind of placed upon us either by society or our family or the past, it's questioning what we consider to be true. And I think Mel Robbins does a good question. She asks a good question that sometimes we as coaches ask, and that is this true? She gave an example, for example, of a banker who saw her advice on whether or not, or said, Mel, can you do a podcast on finding your purpose? And Mel's like, oh, so, what do you want to do? And she said, well, I want to be a teacher. I love working with children. And the question that Mel might have for this banker who wants to be a teacher is like, is it true that you could, like, some people might at a late stage not decide to switch because they think it's too old to learn. And so the question that, is it true that you're ever too old to learn? But I find, I don't know about you, Kari, but that's a question that I do find useful in coaching, and perhaps our audience could question themselves on some assumptions they make, so they can break free of these self-imposed obstacles that their mind is making up.
Yeah. And you bring up a great point, and I love that part of the conversation. You brought up two things, the idea, basically, the image of the ant my takeaway was, you watch a clip. Steven Bartlett brought up this this video of this ant to remind him. He uses it to remind himself whenever he is feeling, maybe when, just to remind himself that limitations are self-imposed most times. There's a video of an ant that a circle was drawn around the ant with a pen, and the ant would just keep walking around in circles and would not cross the drawn boundary. And to him, that was just so analogous with what we do in our brains, right? Mm-hmm. Is that we draw a boundary around ourselves. Mm-hmm. And granted, he understands, and we talk about like the social conventions, maybe the conditioning from society and programming, things that we were told, who we need to be and what makes us good people, etc., what we're meant to do and what we shouldn't do. But then he also talks about the spider. Mm-hmm. And so then there is a spider, and then you draw a circle around the spider, and the spider kind of does the same thing at first, but then he accidentally steps over the line, the hand-drawn line, and from that point on, it's like you can't catch that spider. Yeah. And so they're trying. He's like, I guess, going down the table, and they're trying to draw other lines around the the spider, but now the spider knows what it's like. That wasn't a boundary to begin with, and now it's hard to catch that spider, if ever. And what I took away from that, I think it's such a powerful visual and imagery, since our brains think in images, is that how do we get ourselves to be the type of people that question the boundaries around us? The way that we actually do that is we have to step over the line. Mm-hmm. And what is the equivalent of stepping over the line is being able to ask the question, is this true? Is, like you were saying, is it true that it's too late for me to change jobs? Is it too late for me to start a business? Is it too late to change the relationship I have with my children? Even though, I feel like I've done so much in the past that I wish I was a better parent. Is it too late? And once you allow yourself to ask that question, like you mentioned, Ken, it was one of the most pivotal questions that when I heard that on podcasts, when I first started doing this work, it's like sometimes you don't even know that there are questions that you can ask yourself to help yourself, step over the hand-drawn line, right?
Yeah, when I've seen your excuse me, LinkedIn posts, I marvel at the questions you ask yourself, because then it forces your brain to answer them. And yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting, this podcast. Before I get to some of the things where I feel like there are missing pieces, if people were to listen to this podcast, because I think you're getting at one, right? Asking these powerful questions can help us step over the line. Was there anything else you wanted to share about the I'll quickly say one thing that I think to me is also in line with Adam Grant, which is about chapter 1 is about thinking like a scientist. And Steven mentions this in so many words when he says we need to conduct experiments.
Yes.
And he has a quote that is something like, failure is feedback. Feedback is knowledge, and knowledge is power. So I think that's a powerful paradigm to follow.
Yeah.
If you have the right mindset. And so what is going to lead off this podcast was saying, Kari, I think this is good for people this is good for about 20% of the people out there.
Yeah.
The other 80% whose mindset isn't ready, then they're going to need a little bit of a boost in terms of making decisions, and not just saying you step over the line, not just saying there's also the 51% rule, which we could talk about. But how do you actually get to the point where you're 51% ready to make a decision? I feel like that could be talked a little bit more about, and something we as coaches do. But before I kind of get to the side where I feel like there could be more practical and helpful information for the audience. And
Mhm.
Mel and Steven are fantastic. That's not what I'm saying. I just want for people who, like myself and maybe you, who weren't ready for this information yet, who weren't aware about their self limitations. For those who are aware, these are powerful tips. So one of them, yes, think like a scientist. I will just say that one of the things I learned in science is you don't take knowledge for granted. Somebody writes a paper, before you even take that as fact, you take that paper and you test it yourself in the lab. And then therefore you're verifying that that information is actually works, not just works in general, but works for you.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think that there's two things there. One is to test, right? Like, is this true? Right? You pick up some fact or some story, typically they're stories, and you say, is that true, what we just discussed? And then the second thing is that true for me? Because that's, I do agree with Mel and Steven, is that it has to work for you.
Yes, I think that's fundamental. And I think nowadays, just to play off your last part, is with the noise, and it could be including ourselves out there, especially people who are searching for something to help them, it can feel like you have to follow a certain path. You know, I liken it to climbing out of one box, being like, woohoo, I'm free. I see it. And then then following some other wisdom or something that you hear, but you don't realize actually, if you're not still thinking for yourself and trying to figure out what's still best for you and experimenting and seeing what comes up after, then you're just climbing into another box again, right? But just having that awareness that that's what we're doing is good. It's like, okay, well, let's just climb back out and remember that we have the ability to choose for ourselves in all aspects and find what works for us, instead of necessarily just following just one person, right?
It's in a moment maybe of irony for me. There are at least two parts in the podcast where Steven says, either he doesn't or doesn't recommend his listeners to listen to or read. You know, you're not going to get what you need out of books, out of systems, out of leaders, and he even said out of podcasts. The moment of irony is we're listening to a podcast.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And the other moment of irony is that what we are doing ourselves is a podcast. In a way, right? If what a podcast is just we're conveying information. So that was funny to me. And I think I can hold that in one hand and also go, but I can't extract some useful information. So was there anything else that you got out of the podcast before maybe I have some contrarian viewpoints to share?
Oh, I got a ton out of the podcast, but I'm interested in hearing your contrarian views.
Yeah.
And I think when you use the word contrarian, I think you just mean just something else that you want to offer, right?
Yeah. Thanks for softening it for everybody.
Well, no, I mean, like,
you look nice, Kari. You always do that. No, you're right. What I mean by contrarian is I myself wrote an article about why I don't get anything out of self-help books. And except if you did this one thing, and that is mindset. I've already talked about this. People who don't have the right mindset might not be ready for this podcast or to extract as much as they could out of it. Because I think at one point Mel says, so how do you make a decision? And he just said, in essence, he said, fail fast. And failure is knowledge is failure, is feedback is knowledge is power. And so to experiment, right? But some people are not in that mindset to experiment. They're not ready for that yet. I wasn't ready for that until only very recently. I didn't even know. I had so many fears. I have so many self-limitations about that. So for the person who doesn't necessarily have the right mindset, this podcast might not resonate. Also, he talks about the 51% rule, which if you look at the podcast, it says the 51% rule. Like, she leads off with that in the title. And I'm excited to hear about the 51% rule. And it goes something like this. I mean, first Steven Bartlett talks about there's two types of decisions, type 1 and type 2, as relayed by Jeff Bezos. Type 1 is irreversible, type 2 is reversible. I was asking my wife, what is an irreversible, right? Like, what really would be an irreversible? And to me, it comes down really to matters of life and death. You give life to someone, you don't stick that person back in a womb. That's irreversible. Somebody dies, that's irreversible. Outside of that, almost everything else is reversible. Now, within the type 2 reversible ones, he then goes on and talks about this speaking opportunity he had with President Obama, whether or not he spoke with Obama or just at the same event, probably the latter. President Obama was talking about the decision he made to take down Osama bin Laden. And there was a 50% chance that he was there in that compound. And he decided to go for it. And he said the only guarantee or the only certainty you might have if something is true is in hindsight. So as long as you have 51%, then it's okay, right? You're never going to be 100% certain. And so I think this does give you permission to try experiments, to fail. My little brain is saying, what does 51%? Like, how do you know you're at 51%? So this is where I feel like it's something that's, at first it sounds good. This is coming from President Obama. It's a critical decision he made. It's a truth that you can never have 100% certainty. But I don't know if this really helps audiences understand how do you actually make decisions. And Brooke Castillo, who's my mentor in the Life Coach School, one thing is she says there's no wrong decisions. I would further add, though, there are decisions that are better than other decisions in that they can help deliver the result you want more so than other decisions. And I think that's what people are struggling with. I don't know if somebody who has self-doubt or is a perfectionist will be able to practically go, oh, I'm at 51%. Let's go make this decision. So that's my first kind of, I'm not so sure this really helped me in that way.
Yeah.
I wanted to present that to you and see what you might have to think about that.
Yeah. And you know what? I think you're speaking to a really important thing. It depends on what stage each of us are at in our respective journeys, right? So I remember there was a time when I was incredibly depressed and I was going on the internet to just learn more about depression. And I found a lot of help in mental health blogs, right? It helped me feel seen. We were all talking about, it was very hard to even get out of bed. We were all experiencing the shame of it. We were trying to rally each other. But as I started listening to different input, and as I started to grow and invite myself to just as I moved along in my own journey, what I started noticing was that those same people kept on month after month commenting and supporting about how they were still struggling. And to me, that felt very sad. And I realized that if I stayed in that place, there was definitely a place for that certain stage, but it wasn't no longer a place for me. And that was okay. I was grateful for that space and I needed that space. I'm grateful for those people in that space. And now I'm in this space. So instead of making that space wrong, it was like, oh, I'm actually now in a different leg of my journey. And so now I'm looking for different things that resonate with the leg in my journey and my aspirations in this moment with the capabilities I have, with the emotional, and cognitive bandwidth that I have just right now. I'm still not over here to do 51%, let's just say, making 50 decisions at 51%, but maybe I'm further along than I was over here. So that's been really helpful for me, because otherwise you feel like you're getting whiplash. Do I do this? Do I do that? Do I follow this person? Do I follow this advice? All the time remembering or forgetting that we have the the number one thing we want to do is remember that that's just information. And we get to use our brain to say, what do we need? What is our capacity right now, emotionally, or, even tactically, strategically, but even mentally? What is it right now? And then filtering everything through that, meaning like that would be, some people might say like, that would be amazing to be able to make those decisions a lot faster, because a lot of us are overthinkers and we struggle to make those decisions. And like you said, we struggle to figure out what that 51% is but to me, it's more like, I would eventually like to be able to not get so paralyzed by decision making. So I'm going to hold this as there's people that are very successful that one of the common traits, if I look at all of them, seem to be this ability to make decisions. And I think what it comes with, it's not necessarily the decisions that paralyze people, or maybe they're focused on the decisions. When our power comes, where we empower ourselves, is to say, I was so worried about the decision, but in actuality, what I really want to do is really get good at what consequences come from me making a decision. If I can have my own back, and if I can handle my own mind and be in my own body after making a decision, the decision itself doesn't become as high stakes, because we know actually we can just make another decision. But I think, so that's where I think we're coming from, is I think you're right. Maybe it's more of a conversation, like in addition to this conversation about this podcast. And obviously they each have their own separate podcasts. They probably discussed this thing in detail, and I know they do. But like for us talking this conversation, that is a gap, isn't it? Is maybe the tie that we people who are paralyzed by decision making is because they think it's the decision that's causing the fear, but the relief and the confidence comes from, oh wait, I get to make the decision, and I work on having my own back. I work on my thoughts, what I'm going to let myself think about myself, what I'm going to make things mean if the consequences of me making that decision doesn't exactly pan out the way that I had hoped. In which case, I'm safe to make decisions, because I'm not going to be the one person that's going to, tear myself up. I'm going to be the one person that will have my own back and say, okay, we tried something and now we're going to move forward, right? So maybe it's the place, the emphasis of where. What do you think?
I think you're spot on. And I think this is why people need coaching is, do you have your own back?
And what does that even mean, right?
What does that mean? What scares you about this decision? You talk about consequences. I think not too long talking to a mentee about deciding whether to go into project management or website design. And her fear was, if she chose one thing, would something else be better? And so this is in the same category of what you're talking about. In one case, the fear is what you alluded to, is what if I don't have my own back? In this case, hers is the fear of, could there be something better? And this is all separate than the decision itself, right? This is what you're talking about. It's in a different place. I like that. It's in a different place. And so I think coaching is really helpful when a client has these kinds of fears, making sure we talk through all those fears and getting comfortable with them. And now then you're able to access that 51%. Because without that, when something else is trapping you, then you can't even think about, the point where we're like getting to the 51% where Obama says, let's send in the 2 helicopters to do our mission. So I think, yes, to recap, before we talk about 51% decision making, there's another layer here, and that's the client's own mind and the fears that are preventing them from taking the next step, whether it's having their own back in your example, And this is perfect opportunity to talk to somebody who can help you, because I think a lot of fears are just irrational and we just don't know it. They just take a hold of us and we believe them to be true. And when we talk it out, it's not so scary. So thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks for walking us through that, Kari. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And no, go ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, okay. You know, and I think what we're also coming down to too is when I say consequences of decisions, it's just the natural course of how things work. You have something in front of you and you make a decision, or you decide something, to take a course of action, to say something, to whatever it is, then the natural course of events occur after that, right? And obviously, I think the difference between us in certain circumstances of our life making decisions versus like a president of the United States making a call, a significant call that has the potential to obviously disrupt human life, right? At the same time, a mission is important. The mission is of a certain level of importance. In that case, I can see in extremely pressurized situations that most of us will never understand what it feels like, that 51% is a much different type of decision-making process than most of us ever have to face. So I do think we just need to kind of clarify a little bit. I understand that, Steven Bartlett brought it up as an example, but also Steven Bartlett has, has businesses, valued at 600 million, et cetera. And so that's not to make anything, not to bring that as in part of like, oh, there are a certain class of decision making, but it is to say that it depends on what you want in life.
Mm-hmm.
Certain decisions might require something more of like, is this more likely to be beneficial and serve us or not? And you go by that versus like something where you might like to have, let's just say, closer to 85 or 90%. Like we get to decide with the specific decisions that we have at hand to make what level is what's actually needed in the moment. And I think that's part of what you and I discuss a lot, is this ability to use our own discernment, decide what's needed, right? So it's not like a blanket 51% is for every decision. We get, it's just kind of like using our own agency and our ability to reflect on what's needed and being able to choose which tool we use when, given the stakes.
Yeah, I'm going to have one last bit of feedback here, which is very self-promotional.
Oh, okay.
And then I'm going to switch to one other thing, at least, that I found that needs a little bit more careful thinking, which, whatever we're saying here, probably also, if listeners were to, or viewers were to watch us go, well, I'm not so sure, Nick, did you think about this situation? So you can't say it all in a particular snapshot and get everything you want to say. So I'm going to grant that grace to them. I'm just making comments. John Doer, John Doer, wrote a book on making decisions. And Mel kept asking Steven for a rubric on how you make decisions. And I'm like, John Doer actually has a rubric. Decisions are based on 3 different buckets: how insight, purpose, and significance. And what I've done is I've taken this in a way that combines my life coach school training, and I'm going to do a workshop on it because I'm inspired. I want other people to go at least have a framework.
Yeah.
My first principles on decision making, so that they can get to the 51%. Like, what is the best decision for me? And how do I do that? So I will organize a meetup for that. That will be fun.
Nice. Yep.
And then the other thing here again, bearing in mind that Steven Bartlett himself says maybe you shouldn't listen to podcasts or leaders or things like that. You need to experiment. And one of those things I would experiment is the pace of decisions. Mm-hmm. He gives a story of he is on the board of a father and son. With the father, he makes a suggestion. The father comes back 9 months later and says, let's implement it or not. And then with the son, same idea. And in the middle of the meeting in which he's pitching the idea, the son says, great idea. Let's talk to marketing. Let's implement this decision. Steven Bartlett says that's the difference between the son and the father and why the son is so much more successful than the father in business, millions and millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, he says. I think that is one data point. I myself have thought the speed of decisions is important to people's success. I think the quality of decision is more important than the speed of decision. I'm going to go back to Think Again, that book I mentioned by Adam Grant. Mm-hmm. And he talks about in the very first story he mentions is a person who looks at a fund and it's earning not like bonkers returns, but steady returns. He sees that his friends and noted experts are also invested in the fund. And he makes the quick decision to invest his money, I believe 1/3 of his retirement. And then, wouldn't you know it, I already knew the answer as I was reading it. He lost it all. Mm-hmm. Because this is a story of one of Bernie Madoff's investors.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
Could you say that maybe the speed of making a decision without due diligence caused this person harm? I just want to caution on that the speed of decisions is what leads people to success, that we don't necessarily just go and start making speedy decisions without due diligence. To me, that was something I wanted to flag, at least in my own head, as something I wouldn't necessarily buy into. And I think Steven Bartlett would appreciate that.
Mm. Yeah, I think he definitely would appreciate the fact that you're once again saying we got to do what's right for us, right? And that's what that's what he said at the very, very beginning. And that's what, Mel says, is that we, regardless of what's out there. And I think that's kind of what you were alluding to before when you were talking about like him saying about you're not going to find the answers to your life decisions and podcasts and things like that. And I think what, to me, what my takeaway from that was sacrificing your own ability to choose for yourself. You're not going to find it out there. But if you learn, if you're educating, which obviously he and Mel both do as well, right? If you're interested in learning, and if you're interested in just gathering additional information, additional thoughts out there that maybe weren't even in your awareness until you heard it spoken somewhere or until you read a sentence somewhere, and now it is in your awareness, and you're like, whoa, was that even possible? And might not act on it, but at least it's something that now your thought capacity or your understanding of possibility and potentiality has increased because you've heard a story about something that you never even knew was in existence. To me, there's value in that. But of course, I think what he was saying is if you're constantly looking for the right thing to make the decision outside of yourself, you're missing a very important and probably the most important part. All that to me is interesting and great. I love it for increasing my idea of what's possible out there, and for myself, for other people, how I can exist in the world, the type of person I can be, even if I start from, even if my first half of my life was not so great in terms of the way that I showed up. Wow, now I have awareness that there's other people that might have similar situations because I listened to something, and maybe I'm just going to use that as a seed to be like, it might be possible for me as well. But ultimately, the individual decisions I make in my life and how I move forward from this point forward will not come from them. It will be a place where you get to the point where you have to exercise your own choice in the next steps that you want to take. And some of those decisions that you make, often, actually many of them will include, especially if you do want to change and break old habits or old ways of being, to invite yourself to have a new experience or a different experience in life and to create different results and opportunities for yourself than before. It definitely will require new decisions being made. And the scary part is, as you were talking about with one of those videos, the very first video on the motivational triad, it does feel very scary. And it does feel like it's going against what our body is telling us. And that's when we, will lean, if you want to follow that path of change, it will require some more awareness and discernment of your psychological safety to make these decisions, and then to be with yourself after you make decisions. And I don't want to keep saying consequences. What word am I looking for, Ken? Anyway,
Yeah.
being with yourself and your mind and body,
Yeah.
whatever may be, because of those decisions you made.
So I'm just going to start wrapping this up in terms of a final word. What I extracted from what you said, it's like going to a buffet. And in the buffet, there's almost limitless possibilities in the different types of foods you can eat. And what Mel and Steven has offered are different types of foods that we get to partake in. And then we get to decide whether that tastes to us or more of that. So thank you for this coaching conversation, Kari Watterson.
You're welcome.
I look forward to doing again soon.